Wow, wow. Wow, right? Wow. So fatherhood. Been thinking about that all week. I bet all of you today are going to take a copy of the scripture, go home, put it on a piece of wood, decoupage it, and hang it on your wall, right? 'Cause all your life you've been waiting to hear this text, right? And apply it to fatherhood. Fatherhood is a challenging deal. That's why the scriptures about it are so challenging. Some of you had the opportunity to sort of grow into it. You had 9 months to get ready for it. I didn't have that opportunity. I was standing at the back of a church, Tulsa Memorial Drive, Methodist Church in Tulsa, single, fancy-free, just life easy as it could be. I walked up the aisle of the church where Dr. George Warren married Prudy and me. And then I started walking back down the aisle of the church after we were married. I had 2 kids, 3 dogs, a cat, and a mortgage. Just like that, in 15 minutes, right? I didn't get that 9-month deal to sort of grow into and figure it out. And honey, it's been nothing like you said it would be. Nothing. Not one bit of it, Because when you're young and you're thinking about fatherhood, you think you see these moments in your life, when I'm teaching him to swing the bat, hit a home run, she comes at that most important moment in her life with the most important question of her life, and I'm giving the wise advice. And then it turns into, can I have the car? Do you have $20? Can I get some money out of your wallet? It's just nothing like what you think it's going to be. You need help. And that's the first thing I'd say about fatherhood is you really need help. You need help. You need encouragement, affirmation. And in the Methodist Church, we have this way of looking at fatherhood that's really interesting. We don't just talk about biological fathers, as important as they are. We talk about all of our spiritual fathers. That's what this day is about. Honoring your spiritual father. Who are those men in your life who helped you on your spiritual journey? And that may have been the dad that was, there at the window, banging on the window, 30 minutes after you were born. It may be a grandpa, an uncle, a coach, a stepdad, however that happened in your life. This day is about honoring them. But all of them were people that at one point or another realized they needed help to be a dad, to take on that role in their life. And for me, one of the best things that ever happened to me was when I was in college, a teacher made me read something I didn't want to read. I was reading this story just so I could write a paper and turn it in class, but the story stuck with me because it's so profound. And in that 15-minute turnaround when I became a dad, that story just popped immediately into my head and became a guiding light for me in being a father. The story was written by Ernest Hemingway. Right? It's the kind of thing your teacher makes you read in college or maybe high school. And it's called The Capital of the World. And it's a story he wrote based on a true story. He just sort of rewrote it in a short story version. It's about a father and a son who have a huge fight. Right? And that never happens in our families, but in Hemingway's family, apparently that had happened. And so this story captured his attention. This father and this son, they have this huge fight. And the boy leaves home vowing never to return. I only did that 12 times, I think, growing up. But anyway, he leaves and he vows never to come back. And at first the father's just like, well, I don't care. You treat me with disrespect. You can't treat me with disrespect. But after a little while, the father starts to worry about his son. And he's thinking about how much he loves his son. He wants his son to come home, but he doesn't know where he is. So he goes to the local newspaper and he rents a full page, buys a full page ad. And he puts on that ad, Paco, please come home. All is forgiven. Meet you at the Hotel Mandera Tuesday at noon. Words to that effect. He does this ad, this wonderful ad. Meet at the Hotel Montana noon Tuesday. All is forgiven, Papa. All is forgiven, Papa. And he just rents out a full page in the paper and he puts that in there. And then Tuesday, he goes to the hotel, hoping that somehow, his son has seen it. This is set in Spain. He goes to the hotel, and when starting to walk up to the hotel, there are police everywhere. And he's just thinking the worst. What has happened? Has my son been here? Has something terrible happened to my son? And he walks up, and the police officer says to him, are you Paco's dad? He goes, yeah. And the policeman says, come over here. And they have these hundreds of boys lined up. And he said, every one of these boys is named Paco. Which one is yours? right? Because here are these, and Hemingway says 800 young men showed up that day seeking their father's forgiveness. Some of them weren't even named Paco. They wanted to be forgiven by their dad. Right? We want to be loved by our fathers. And as fathers, we want to love our children. We want our children to know we love them. And I want to just say it, I'll probably say it over and over today, but lock this in your head. The door to love, that door is called forgiveness. You can't love if you don't forgive. That's the doorway that leads to love, forgiveness. Today's story is a story about a father who had trouble forgiving his son. He was named David. He was the king. And David had been going through a horrible time in his life. Like the prophet Nathan had warned him after David had the terrible sin with Bathsheba. Nathan had said to him, now, your family is going to be torn apart by turmoil. And that's what had happened. Incest, rape, murder, all in his family. In fact, his son Absalom had killed his brother Amnon, who had assaulted his sister Tamar, sexually attacked her. So Absalom takes revenge, kills Amnon, and then runs away. I know the journey that he made because I've made it many, many times. I take people there every time we go to Israel. And you go to the area of the Dan, which is the northern part of Israel. It's the headwaters of the Jordan, a river that feeds nations of people. And it's incredibly beautiful. It's forested. It's a national park in Israel. It's very, very beautiful. And it could be 100 degrees everywhere else in Israel, 118, 120 in the desert. You go into that area, and the temperature just drops. And then you go to Mount Bindal. We talked about that last week. You go to Mount Bindal, which is there in the north, and you go over the top. And it's very, very cold. It's wonderful. It's like you've stepped into a giant air-conditioned room on top of that mountain. And you look down into the distance, and it's nothing but desert. All the way to Damascus. That's the journey that Absalom made. Now, Jewish fathers have this thing about Absalom today, even in tradition. Absalom was a bad guy. He rebelled against his dad. David, go ahead and bring that last screen up. Because what they do in Israel, this is supposed to be Absalom's tomb, right? And what they do now in Israel is Jewish dads take their little boys on Father's Day to this tomb. It can't really be Absalom's tomb. It's only about 500 years, but they say it is. And they throw rocks at it. A dad will give his son a rock and say, throw a rock at Absalom's tomb, because he was a bad son. He was a bad son. And there have been times when little Jewish boys threw so many rocks at Absalom's tomb that it covered it. It stands over a story tall. I mean, that's a lot of rocks thrown by little boys. But Jewish dads take their kids there because you're supposed to be nice to your dad. You're supposed to do what's right. Absalom went out into that desert place, a broken man. He had murdered his brother. He had watched his family being torn apart. He had received no compassion, no mercy, no help at all from his father. And he was dwelling there. Now, he had a guy in his life that was really special. The guy's name was Joab. He was the commander of Israel's armies. And he loved David. He loved Absalom. He loved David's family. And he loved Israel. And he looked at this situation, and he went to the boy Absalom, who probably at this point was 17, 18 years old. And he said, look, I'm going to try to get you back together with your dad. It's going to take a lot of effort. You're going to have to humble yourself. You're going to have to do what I tell you to do, but we're going to try to work this out. You know, today is the day we remember those men in our life who maybe weren't our biological dads, but were a father figure to us, who came to us when we needed them the most and saw us through things that we couldn't have got through without them. And that's what Joab is for Absalom. He's also a friend to David. He knows David won't hear him. So he comes up with this amazing story. He goes and he finds a wise woman. Now, you need to know in Jewish culture, a wise woman is about the most powerful thing on the planet. Unfortunately, we have a church filled with wise women, so we're in good shape. This is a wise woman of Tekoa. This is a shot I took on the Temple Mount in Israel of a woman I sort of imagine as this woman from Tekoa. And he says to her, Joab says to her, here, I've got a little story for you. Go tell this story to the king. So she goes to the king, and she's dressed up in black like she's mourning the death of a loved one. And she goes to King David, because that's what you could do in those days. You had a problem, you go to the king would fix it. Sort of like the Godfather movies. And then later, if the king had done you a favor, he'd call you in and say, remember I did you a favor? Now you need to do me a favor. It's that kind of a deal. So she goes to the king. She says, I'm in mourning. I'm in grief. My 2 sons were out in the field. They got into an argument. They started fighting. And one of my sons killed the other son. Now, none of this is true. This is just a little story Joab has told her to tell. And she says, and then everybody wants to kill my other son because he's a murderer. And he's run off, and I'm never going to see him again. And I'm an old woman, and I'm sad, and I'm in grief. And if they kill my only boy, I'll have no one. I'll be alone in the world. It was a mistake. It was all a terrible mistake. Your Majesty, is there anything you could do to help me? And David is touched by her and her story. David gets touched by stories. Remember the Nathan thing in Bathsheba, right? David is touched by this story. And he says to this mourning woman, he says to her, look, tell your son to come home. We'll send messengers out. We'll find him. We'll bring him back. Now, I'm going to tell everybody in the kingdom he's under my protection. And we're going to forget what happened. We're going to bring forgiveness and reconciliation to your family. And she looks him in the eye, this brave, wise woman. She looks him in the eye and she says to him, well, Your Majesty, why won't you do that for your own son? Now, every dad in the room today knows that moment. That moment when the light comes on. And you go, oh man, why did I say that? Or why didn't I say that? Or why didn't I go? Or why didn't I stay? We know that moment when it all comes to light. And David is having that moment as a dad. And David's a smart guy. He looks at this woman and he says to her, Joab made you do this, didn't he? And she says, yep, that's right. He glances at Joab, who he could have had put to death, just like that. Glances at Joab, his old friend, who he knows loves Absalom like a son. And he looks at the woman and says, tell Joab. Joab standing in the room says to her, tell Joab to bring Absalom home. Now, that would be a great story if it ended there, right? Absalom comes home and they make up and they have a happy life together, but that's not what David does. And fathers, there's a caution here for us. Because we can sort of defect in place sometimes as dads. We act like we're in the program, but we're really not. You know, we act like we're really enthused about the dance recital, but we're really not, right? We act like this is the greatest soccer match we've ever seen in the world, even though our little one has scored 6 goals for the other team. We act like we're in it, but we're really not in it. And that's a huge sin. That's a broken place to be. So David says to Joab, yeah, bring Absalom home, but he has to stay in his own house. I don't want to see him ever again. So there's a public sort of a view that David has welcomed Absalom back, but actually Absalom hasn't been welcomed back. David keeps him at a distance. Whenever we keep a child at a distance, we're failing as a father. And so Absalom is just in agony. He says, why did I even come back? Again, remember, he's probably just a teenager. He's going, why did I even come back? It'd be better if I was just dead. And he starts calling Uncle Joab and saying, Uncle Joab, can you take me to see my dad? And at this point, Uncle Joab says, I've done enough. I don't want any more. Because, right, it's easy to do and do the right thing the first time. It's the 29th and the 30th time that it's hard to do the right thing. And so finally, out of desperation, Absalom goes out and has his servants burn Joab's field down. And Joab marches in angry and furious. Says, why have you done this to me? You're like a son to me, and why now you've destroyed my food source? He says, it's because you won't respond to me. And we know in that moment that Absalom is feeling the absence of Joab and the absence of his father, David. There's an indictment in the words of the great child psychologist, D.W. Winnicott, who wrote, every single crime can be traced to an absent father. Now, that may be a little bit of hyperbole, but there's a lot of power in that. The pain of an absent father can be overwhelming in a child's life. And you don't have to be gone to be absent. You can be in the room every day and still be absent. And this teenager now is crying out for help. He goes, my dad just is 2 houses down, but I haven't seen him for 2 years. He hasn't talked to me. He hasn't asked me how I am. I haven't heard the words I love you from him for 2 years. I might as well be dead. And when children have a distant father, a distant relationship with their father, that's often what they feel. I might as well be dead. And Joab's heart is broken. There's no games now, no wise women to come in, no clever stories. Joab goes to David and says, you got to bring your son home. You've got to forgive him. You've got to. Finally, David is reached. David invites his son home. And there's a scene that will sound very familiar to you because Jesus picks up this imagery and Jesus uses it in the prodigal son. That moment, that scene in the prodigal son story when the son returns and his father welcomes him back. Every person who heard Jesus preach that parable would have known this story about Absalom. I know that it's the foundation for the prodigal son story. Absalom falls down weeping and crying at the feet of his father. His dad gathers him up in his arms and loves him, kisses him, and holds him. And the moment of reconciliation has come. Fathers, our job is to be reconcilers in our home. Our job is to be people who bring about reconciliation. That means being vulnerable and open. That means confessing our weaknesses and calling on God for strength. That means being willing to listen to a good word from a fellow person of faith. One of the smartest things you can do as a father is develop a network of 2 or 3 Christian friends that you can go to and say, hey, here's the situation. What do you think I ought to do? Or that you can call late at night and say, would you pray for my children with me, please? Fathers, be intentional in that. Be an agent of reconciliation. Be a healer. Lots of times dads think their job is to be the disciplinarian. That's what David was trying to be. He was trying to be the disciplinarian. Every child needs discipline. But he needs love more than that. And he needs to learn how to reconcile and heal relationships. Remember when I said that the door to love is forgiveness? That's what we have to do. We have to forgive our fathers. As fathers, we have to forgive our children. That opens the door to love. That makes loving one another possible. So often it's our pride, I won't let him disrespect me like that gets in the way and keeps us from forgiving. Forget your pride. Take pride in how much you love your children. Take pride in how much you're willing to sacrifice for your children. Take pride in making yourself vulnerable. Take pride in calling on the name of God. That's something to be celebratory about. Forgive and be forgiven. The second thing I would say in David's story is so often we learn about things by sort of, this is what David did, now go and do the opposite, right? And that's what I like to say about this story today. As you read the David story, you go back maybe and read the whole thing all the way through, you'll see something really interesting. David has a relationship with God. Now, like any relationship with God, there are good days and bad days, but he has a relationship with God. But what David never does is he never shares that with his children. Not until he's an old man and he's lying on his dying bed. Then he talks about it, but only then, which is way too late. I want to say something to you today, and it's really, really important. As pastors, we get to be with people at some of the toughest times in their lives. I've done over 600 funerals. I have sat in a room time and time and time again and listened to children talk about their father. I've never heard a child say, God, my dad was great. He bought me the best cars. Or my dad was great. He took me on a lot of expensive trips. Or I've never heard anything like that. What I've heard in those moments, the richest thing that children remember, the thing that means the most to them in those moments, is they'll say, Pastor, I remember the day my dad told me about Jesus. Or I remember the day my dad shared his faith with me. I remember the day that my dad talked about God. Or I remember my dad coming into my room and praying with me every night, all through high school when things were tough. That's what matters. Be intentional in sharing your faith. Don't be condemning. If your kids don't want to go to church, whatever it is, don't condemn them. Just simply talk about your own experience of God and why that's important. Be intentional and committed to that. Share your faith with your children. But there's a bigger calling too. There's a calling to be a Joab in people's lives. For the men of this church, our calling is to be a father to every child in this church. When you take your membership vows, that's part of what you're signing on to do. I know you didn't know that. That's how we do things in the church. I'm telling you now after you've already signed on. That's how we run things in the church, and it's been working great for 2,000 years. We're not going to change today. We are called to be the fathers to every child in this church, and by extension to the children of this community. Take the time, be a part of Vacation Bible School. Be a part of those youth ministry events and trips. You can say, I can't teach. I'm not that kind of person. Stand at the door of this church and greet every child that comes in. Learn their names. Let them know they matter to you. Be committed to every young person that walks through the doors of this church. Go out in the community. Be a part of the reading program. Be a part of the ministries that this church has that change and affect and transform children's lives. That's our calling as Christian men. I was a young boy, my dad died, and then to make matters worse, we moved to a new city where I really didn't know anybody. I had one friend, his name was Tom. And Tom and I were just great friends. We're completely different. He came from the wealthy part of town, I came from the poorest part of town. But we were just buddies. We did sports and stuff together. And one day, Tom's dad, Lenny Grant, was a realtor in Midwest City, came in to talk to my mom, and I thought, oh man, I must be in some big trouble. I don't know what that's about. And after a few minutes, he came in and he talked to me and he sat down in my room. He said, Robert, I want you to know that I go to the Methodist Church, Wickline Methodist Church, and we have a scout troop there. We have Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, and I know that you used to go camping and stuff with your dad before he died. He said, I'm going to take my son Tom to Scouts. I'd like to take you too if you want to go. And I said yes before I could finish the sentence. We have a Eagle Scout Court of Honor today for Ben Bolin. It made me think of this story and really remember this moment. I had the camping gear sitting in the closet that my dad and I used. And it had been sitting there since the day my dad died, unused. Fishing poles, all the things my dad and I did together, untouched. Till my friend's dad came into my life and said, come go with me. Starting that moment all the way through grade school, junior high, high school, and college, Lenny Grant picked me up and took me to every kind of event, paid my way, made sure I got to do whatever I wanted to do, particularly as a scout. On the day it came time for me to receive my Eagle Award, some of you have been to Eagle Scout Court of Honors, you know there's a thing for parents to do. I asked Lyndon to stand in the spot for my dad. I'm a Methodist today and a Methodist pastor because Lyndon Grant came into my life, a man in the church who extended his love to boys and kids who needed it. Not to get anything back in return, but because he understood his calling as a Christian. So my word to you today would be simply this: fathers, be that man. This is the word of God in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We invite you today